This mansion is Marcus's inheritance now. You should find your own place." The words fell from Isabel, my daughter-in-law, like shards of ice, cutting into the solemn air of the funeral hall. She stood there in her elegant black dress, a champagne glass poised in her hand, as if she were raising a toast to triumph rather than mourning death. The chandelier light caught the rim of her glass and sent sharp reflections across the room, mocking the grief that clung to every corner. Gasps rose from the guests around me. One woman clutched her pearls, another lowered her eyes in shame. The organ music faltered, its notes stumbling beneath the weight of Isabel's declaration. What had been a sanctuary of mourning only moments before became a stage for cruelty. My son Marcus stood silent at her side. His face was blank, his eyes darting anywhere but toward me. His silence was its own verdict, more devastating than any insult. My chest tightened as though the very walls of the Harrington estate, the home I had guarded for 30 years, had suddenly turned against me. Memories of birthday candles, garden parties, and evenings by the fireplace with David rushed back, only to collapse beneath the cold truth spoken aloud. I felt the unease in the room as guests shifted, torn between manners and morbid curiosity, unwilling witnesses to my family's betrayal. Isabel, on the other hand, looked radiant. She raised her glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, her green eyes glinting with triumph. In that moment, my grief was eclipsed by humiliation, and I understood that nothing, not even my husband's funeral, could soften the cruelty of those I once called family. Marcus stood beside Isabel, his black suit crisp and flawless, every detail arranged to suggest dignity, yet I saw the truth his silence betrayed. He did not flinch at her ruthless declaration, nor did he raise a hand to shield me from the sting of her words. His gaze slid away, drifting toward the far corner of the hall, as though the flowers or flickering candles there were more deserving of his attention than his own mother. That avoidance was not accident. It was deliberate, cowardly, and cruel. I waited for him to speak, to offer even the smallest protest, but none came. The air between us grew heavy with unspoken truths, pressing against my chest like stone. At last he shifted slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed, and gave a faint nod. In that nod I read everything. He was confirming Isabel's claim, as if the house, the legacy, and even the memory of his father belonged only to them now. What chilled me most was what he held in his hand. Not a prayer book, not even the folded program of his father's funeral, but a glass of red wine. The liquid glowed under the chandelier, dark as spilled blood. He sipped it absent-mindedly, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife, far from the coffin of his father, leaving me abandoned in the shadow of betrayal. My fingers tightened unconsciously around the strand of pearls resting at my throat, the very necklace David had given me on our 25th anniversary. The cool beads pressed into my skin, anchoring me against the tide of disbelief flooding my chest. I had expected cruelty from Isabel. That woman had always worn her ambition like perfume, heavy and suffocating. But Marcus was my son, the boy I nursed through fevers, the teenager I stayed awake for during endless exam nights, the man I once believed would honor his father's legacy. And now he stood silent, complicit, his nod sealing my exile. In the sleepless nights between David's passing and this very funeral, I had entertained a quiet plan. I would pay the inheritance tax myself, using my savings and careful investments, so Marcus would not have to bear the crushing burden. I wanted him to keep the Harrington estate, not just as property, but as the vessel of our family's memories, the birthdays in the garden, the winters by the fire, the roses David had planted with his own hands. I had intended to protect it for him, believing that was what a mother should do. But in that instant I saw with brutal clarity. Marcus did not want the home the way I did. He wanted possession, control, convenience. He was no different from Isabel, hungry for ownership but blind to sacrifice. The realization struck harder than any insult. The grand estate, with its stone walls and sweeping staircase, seemed suddenly foreign. The laughter and warmth it once held dissolved like dust before my eyes. I stood rooted, my body trembling though my face remained still. It was as if the entire world I had built for 30 years crumbled around me, leaving me abandoned in the ruins of my own devotion. The room seemed to widen after the blow, as though the silence itself had pushed the walls farther apart. The Harrington estate loomed around me in all its aged grandeur, the gray brick walls that had weathered a century, the ceilings vaulted high with chandeliers dripping crystal light, and through the tall windows I could see the faint outline of the rose garden, still blooming defiantly against the chill air. At the center of the hall, dominating the space, hung the enormous portrait of David, his stern eyes painted with such precision that they seemed to follow every whispered betrayal. The guests remained frozen, their murmurs swallowed by the tension. Some pretended to study the floral wreaths or the somber drapery, but their glances darted again and again toward me, measuring my reaction, weighing the scandal. No one dared speak, yet the air was thick with unspoken judgment. Then Isabel, with the composure of someone already convinced of her victory, drifted toward the armchair that had always belonged to David. She lowered herself into it with practiced grace, crossing her legs and adjusting the hem of her black dress. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. In front of mourners and family alike, she was declaring herself the new mistress of the house. I stepped back slowly, the polished heels of my shoes clicking softly against the marble floor until my shoulders met the cool pane of the stained glass window. The afternoon sun slanted through the colored glass, scattering hues of crimson and gold across my face, painting me not as the matriarch of the Harrington estate, but as a fragile silhouette, small, diminished, almost erased from my own life. Around me, laughter had died, replaced by the brittle hum of false civility, yet no one moved to comfort me. They all saw what Isabel had done, and what Marcus had allowed, but they looked away, unwilling to intervene. My breath came shallow, but my eyes hardened. Beneath the weight of humiliation, a quiet resolve took root, sharp and unyielding. If they see me as disposable, then they will learn to survive without me. The words thundered in my mind, though my lips never moved. For a moment longer I stood in the fractured light, gathering the pieces of my broken heart into a weapon yet to be revealed. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing a storm beneath my stillness, and the unspoken question rose, heavy and inevitable. What would this mother do in return? When the last of the mourners had departed and the heavy doors closed with a sigh, silence returned to the Harrington estate. The air still carried the mingled scent of lilies and extinguished candles, a suffocating reminder of the day's grief. I sat quietly in the corner of the vast hall, my eyes fixed on the towering portrait of David that hung above the fireplace. His painted gaze, steady and solemn, seemed to search my face for answers I did not yet have. Across the room, however, the mood shifted entirely. Isabel moved briskly, her heels striking the marble as she flipped open a leather-bound sketchbook. She gestured sharply toward the wall beneath David's portrait. "This old painting should come down," she said in a bright, clinical tone. "We need something abstract, modern, something that makes a statement." Marcus stood at her side, arms folded, surveying the room as though he were already its master. He nodded, considering. "We should also knock out that wall," he added, pointing toward the side of the hall. "It would open the space for a bar, perfect for entertaining." On the table between them sat the urn that held David's ashes, its bronze lid gleaming in the muted light. Isabel set her sketchbook beside it, flipping through designs of sleek interiors and glossy countertops. The placement was casual, almost careless, as though the urn were nothing more than a paperweight. My breath caught in my throat. My grief was still raw, yet here they stood, my son and his wife, speaking not of memory or respect, but of demolition and redesign. The contrast cut into me like a blade. My mourning was sacred, but theirs had already transformed into ambition. Isabel closed her sketchbook with a decisive snap and leaned toward me, her tone deceptively gentle, almost syrupy. "Mother, you could consider Sunrise Manor," she said smoothly. "I hear they have excellent wellness programs there. People your age need companionship, activities that suit them. You would be happier among your peers. Her smile was polished, but I saw the glint in her eyes, betraying the calculation behind her courtesy. Marcus picked up her thread almost seamlessly, nodding as though the idea were sensible, inevitable. She is right, Mom, he added, his voice calm but detached. This house is far too large for you to manage alone. It is not safe, not practical. Isabel and I will take care of the costs, of course. You just need to be ready to move out. The words struck me with the weight of dismissal, as if my decades in the Harrington estate could be folded away as neatly as old linens. The tone was not one of concern, but of obligation, a transaction disguised as kindness. I sat very still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I did not trust my voice to speak, for fear it would tremble. Outwardly I maintained composure, but inside my chest quaked. The betrayal that cut deepest was not Isabel's ambition, which I had expected, almost predicted, but Marcus's easy agreement. My son, my only child, the boy I had once shielded from every storm, now cast me aside as though I were nothing more than a burden to be relocated. My gaze drifted from the present to the memory of that night, the night David's breathing had slowed into painful pauses, the night the Harrington estate seemed to hold its breath with him. I sat at his bedside, clutching his frail hand, the once strong fingers now cool and trembling. His eyes, though dimmed, still carried the steady resolve of a man who had built everything around us. Everything is yours, Jeannie, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You have full control. Marcus inherits nothing unless you are gone. Do not let anyone force you. Promise me that. Tears streaked my cheeks, but I nodded, unable to refuse him. The room filled with the muted scratch of a fountain pen, the soft shuffle of papers. Richard Chen, our trusted lawyer, sat nearby, bearing silent witness as David's signature flowed across the parchment. The weight of the document felt heavy then, almost ceremonial, though I told myself it was only precaution, a safeguard I would likely never use. Now, sitting in the same house where those words had been spoken, I finally understood. The will was not merely a legal formality, it was David's shield, a fortress of ink and law placed around me. He had foreseen perhaps the hunger in Marcus or the ambition in Isabel, and in his final act of love, he had given me not just protection, but the power to decide, to endure, and to resist the betrayal unfolding before me. Marcus carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. To him, the house was no longer a question but a certainty, a prize transferred into his name as naturally as blood inheritance. He spoke of renovations and ownership with the careless entitlement of someone convinced the law itself stood behind him. But I remembered differently. The memory of Richard Chen's calm, precise voice returned with sharp clarity, as if he were standing beside me even now. The title may be shifted for tax purposes, he had said, tapping his pen against the parchment, but the authority remains with you. If you choose to sell, to lease, or to preserve this estate as it is, no one, not Marcus, not Isabel, can override your decision. At the time, I had dismissed those words as dry legalese, an afterthought meant only for accountants. Yet in this moment, replaying them against the backdrop of my son's betrayal, they shone like a lantern in a cavern. Marcus thought he was master of the estate, but in truth, his hands were tied. The realization steadied my trembling heart. I was not powerless, not the discarded widow my son believed. Within the very ink of the law, David had left me a weapon. And now, as I watched Marcus and Isabel sketch their dreams atop the ashes of my grief, I felt a flicker of strength ignite. The estate was not theirs to claim. It was mine to wield, and I would choose when and how to let it go. That evening I retreated to the library, the one room in the house that still felt like mine. The scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me like a cloak, muffling the echo of Isabel's voice and Marcus's silence. I lowered myself into David's leather armchair, my body heavy with grief, yet alive with a strange new energy. For days I had considered a final sacrifice. I would empty my accounts, sell my quiet investments, even liquidate bonds I had guarded for years, all to cover the inheritance tax Marcus could never pay. It would have been my last gesture of love, my final shield for a son I believed would cherish the estate. But the memory of his nod, his quiet consent to Isabel's cruelty, stripped that thought bare. Gratitude had no place in him. Respect had withered. My hands trembled as I reached into the safe behind the bookshelf. Inside lay neat stacks of documents, the will, the deeds, the ledgers of my investments. I spread them across the desk, the lamplight glinting off the ink like steel. For a moment I stared, my pulse uneven. Then my gaze hardened and my breath steadied. If they want to treat me as disposable, then I will show them what it means to be dispossessed. The words pulsed through my mind, cold and steady, sharper than any spoken threat. Downstairs, their chatter floated upward, muffled but sharp enough to pierce the silence. Their voices danced with excitement, sketching out a future that treated the Harrington estate as their blank canvas. Isabel's tone was brisk, certain. Marble countertops, a grand piano for the living room, a wine cellar for their parties. Marcus agreed with nods, his words already claiming ownership as though entitlement were stronger than blood. But upstairs, in the dim light of my bedroom, I stood before the tall window overlooking the rose garden. Shadows stretched across the lawn, painting the evening in shades of melancholy. In my hand I held the will, its parchment edges worn but unyielding. I traced David's signature with my fingertip, the ink binding my authority as firmly as any chain of iron. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. An older woman, fragile in posture yet fierce in the quiet curl of her lips. A fleeting smile flickered there, unmistakable. It was not surrender but revelation, the subtle triumph of someone carrying a secret blade beneath her grief. The noise of their dreams continued below, oblivious. They imagined a house that was already theirs. I knew better. The estate was not a prize for them to plunder, but a fortress I commanded. The will was my weapon, silent and invisible, stronger than any scheme whispered under chandeliers. As the last light of day washed my face in gold, the truth crystallized. I was not weak. I was not cornered. I held the power, and my children did not even know it. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the Harrington estate, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the air. On the mahogany breakfast table lay a thick envelope stamped with the unmistakable seal of the IRS. I watched Isabel, still wrapped in her silk robe, reach for it eagerly, her manicured nails slicing through the paper with practiced impatience. I could see the spark in her eyes. She imagined a certificate, something grand and official, the words "inheritance" officially transferred, the final confirmation of what she already believed was hers. A satisfied smile curved on her lips as she unfolded the letter and began to read. Then the smile faltered. Her eyes widened, scanning the dense black type until they froze on the words, "Notice of Federal Estate Tax Due." Beneath it stood a figure printed in bold, several $1,000,000, with a deadline looming in unforgiving clarity. The silence shattered with a thud. Isabel's cappuccino slipped from her trembling hand, crashing onto the pristine white carpet. Brown liquid spread in an ugly stain, mocking the elegance she clung to. She stared at it numbly, as if the mess itself were laughing at the ruin of her dream. I remained upstairs and heard her muffled gasp, the crash of porcelain. I did not move, but a flicker of grim understanding crossed my mind. The storm had arrived, not for me but for them. Downstairs, Marcus fumbled with his phone, sweat on his fingers as he scrolled through the family's bank accounts. I knew what he saw: balances too small, accounts too thin. The tax was a mountain, and his resources were pebbles. Isabel's voice broke into a shriek. "You told me this house was ours. You said it was inheritance, whole and simple. Why are we being asked for millions?" Her cry echoed against the marble, sharp as blame. Marcus tried to steady his voice, though panic wavered through it. "Calm down. Mom will pay. She has savings, investments. She won't let the house go, not after everything. This place means too much to her." But I recognized it for what it was. Not confidence, but confession. For the first time the truth surfaced. Marcus had never truly stood on his own. His career, his comforts, his very home had always leaned on me. Without me, his wealth was an illusion, his stability a fragile mask. Isabel paced furiously, her silk robe whipping as she hissed, "So we're at her mercy. After all this, we are still waiting for her to save us." Marcus said nothing. His silence was louder than words. They had built nothing of their own. They had only borrowed, leaned, demanded, and now the debt had come due. The days that followed were filled with frantic transactions, each one more humiliating than the last, and I watched from a distance. Marcus drove his beloved BMW to a dealership, the metallic blue paint still gleaming under the sun. The offer was insultingly low, yet he signed the papers anyway, his jaw tight, his pride dissolving into necessity. Isabel, meanwhile, laid out her collection of Chanel handbags and jeweled watches, her hands trembling as she photographed each one before listing them for private sale. I imagined the sting she felt as strangers haggled over their worth, each bargain cutting into her vanity like a blade. The cash trickled in, but I knew as well as they did that when stacked against the towering sum demanded by the IRS, it was laughably small. What they gained could not even cover the interest, let alone the principal. The pressure soon cracked their fragile alliance. Isabel's voice rose, sharp and shrill like shattered glass. "You're naive, Marcus. You thought everything would fall into place without consequence. You promised me this house." Marcus fired back, his face flushed with fury. "And you pushed for more, Isabel, always more, the designers, the parties, your endless ambition. You bled us dry." Desperation drove them to the bank, clutching neat folders of paperwork. I did not need to be there to know how it ended. The loan officer, polite yet firm, shook his head. Their credit history was shallow, their assets unstable. Years of leaning on my wealth had left them with no foundation of their own. When they walked out of that sterile office, I knew the weight of rejection clung to them like ash. For the first time, Marcus and Isabel were forced to feel the world without the cushion of my sacrifice, and it was merciless. I moved through the halls of the Harrington estate like a ghost, present yet invisible. I heard the raised voices, the slammed doors, the hurried footsteps as Marcus and Isabel scrambled to salvage their collapsing dream. But I offered no counsel, no soothing words, not even reproach. When Isabel demanded to know why I was so calm, I answered softly, almost serenely. "Taxes are the concern of heirs. I am only a guest in this house now." My words struck like ice, silencing the room for a moment before the chaos resumed. To them, it sounded like surrender. To me, it was something else entirely, a withdrawal of protection, a declaration that I would not rescue them this time. Each night, after the arguments dwindled into exhausted silence, I retreated to my room and opened a small, leather-bound notebook. By lamplight, I recorded the unfolding tragedy in neat, steady script. Day 1, panic. Day 2, sold the car. Day 5, quarreling. Day 7, desperation. The pages filled slowly, each entry less of a lament and more of a chronicle, a record of my children's descent. My hand trembled sometimes, but my mind grew sharper with every line. What began as grief hardened into resolve. By writing it down, I stripped the chaos of its power and turned it into evidence, proof not of my weakness, but of their folly. As the nights passed, I realized I no longer wept. I was not merely a grieving widow. I was becoming a strategist. The silence that cloaked me was not emptiness, but preparation. The woman they thought defeated was watching, waiting, sharpening her will in the shadows. While Marcus and Isabel drowned in arguments and desperate phone calls to lenders, I quietly made my own move. I contacted Richard Chen, the family lawyer who had stood witness the night David signed his will. The meeting was arranged discreetly, far from the suffocating walls of the Harrington estate, in a sleek glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and ink, its mahogany table polished to a mirror's sheen. I sat with poise, my hands steady as I reviewed the thick stack of documents before me. Line after line reaffirmed what David had promised. The estate remained under my authority, untouched by Marcus's illusions of ownership. I lifted the pen, its weight familiar and grounding, and signed each page with deliberate grace. Outside the window, the city roared with life, but inside, A profound calm enveloped me. I was not the widow they thought fragile. I was the executor of my husband's foresight. Richard Chen watched me with quiet approval, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "Mrs. Harrington, your husband was a very wise man," he said softly. "He anticipated this situation long before it arrived." I closed the folder and met his gaze, my eyes resolute. Then it is time I put his wisdom to use. When I first returned to the estate after my meeting with Richard Chen, a pang of guilt still lingered. Marcus was my only son, the child I had once carried through storms of illness and fear. A part of me clung to the memory of his laughter as a boy, the tenderness of a small hand clasping mine. The thought of stripping him of the home he believed was his left me unsettled, wavering on the edge of maternal instinct. But that hesitation shattered when I stepped into the hall and heard their voices. Marcus and Isabel were at it again, arguing not about survival, not about dignity, but about how soon I would step in to rescue them. "She'll pay," Marcus insisted, his voice firm with entitlement. "She always does." Isabel scoffed, pacing the marble floor. "Then why hasn't she yet? We can't wait forever. What good is her fortune if she doesn't use it for us?" I froze, the words striking me like stones. Not once did they speak of my sacrifice, my grief, or my right to peace. To them, I was not a mother but a vault, a living bank waiting to be opened. The last threads of hesitation unraveled. I was done being their safety net. From this moment I would not bend, I would not yield. I would stand as David had intended, strong, decisive, and untouchable. At night Marcus and Isabel paced the halls, their voices low but strained, circling the same desperate question. Would I intervene? Every plan they made collapsed back into that single hope, as if my fortune were the only rope left to cling to. Yet the longer my silence stretched, the heavier their fear became. When I returned from Manhattan, my steps were steady, my heart no longer trembling. The estate was quiet, its grandeur muted by shadows, the echoes of their arguments still clinging to the marble. I moved to the parlor where the fireplace glowed with a gentle fire. Lowering myself into the chair that had once been David's, I let the warmth bathe my weary hands. My fingers rose to the pearls at my throat, the necklace that had survived decades of joy and grief. I touched them lightly, as if drawing strength from David himself. Then, in a whisper meant only for the flames, I spoke. "David, you were right. They never truly grew, and now I will not save them any more." The fire crackled in answer, casting sparks into the dark room. For the first time, I felt no sorrow in my resolve, only clarity. The conference room seemed to hover above the city, its glass walls catching the roar of Wall Street and holding it at bay. Inside, however, the air was taut and still, as if even the skyscrapers leaning against the horizon were waiting for judgment. Richard Chen moved with deliberate calm, setting a thick folder of documents on the polished mahogany table. His expression was unreadable, a mask honed by decades of handling secrets that had broken families. Marcus shifted uneasily in his chair, tugging once at his tie, while Isabel perched beside him, her posture perfect, though her hand betrayed a faint tremor. Across from them, I sat with an air of serenity that unsettled them both. Draped in my navy wool coat, I appeared more composed than they had ever seen me, my sorrow replaced by an almost regal stillness. Richard cleared his throat, sliding the folder open. His voice was measured, every syllable deliberate. According to the last will and testament of Mr. David Harrington Sr., the entirety of the estate, including the family mansion, all shares and investment portfolios, falls under the sole authority of Mrs. Genevieve Harrington. The son, Marcus Harrington, shall inherit only upon her passing and only at her discretion. The words landed like a hammer. Marcus's breath caught. "No, no, that's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "Father left everything to me. He told me, he promised, this house was mine." Beside him, Isabel's complexion drained of color. Her manicured nails dug into the leather of her handbag, as though she could claw back the certainty slipping from her grasp. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the relentless ticking of the antique clock on the far wall. Tick, tick, tick. each sound a nail sealing the coffin of their illusions. I did not gloat, nor did I falter. I folded my hands atop the table, my eyes calm, reflecting both the strength of David's foresight and my own newfound resolve. For the first time, Marcus and Isabel realized they were no longer facing the grieving widow they thought fragile. They were facing the lawful mistress of the estate, backed by the weight of the law itself. Richard closed the folder gently but firmly, the snap of paper against wood echoing louder than any argument. "The terms are explicit," he said evenly. "They cannot be contested." The room seemed to tilt, its walls closing in on Marcus and Isabel as the truth pressed down on them. What they had believed untouchable, the mansion, the wealth, the future they had already spent in their minds, was slipping from their reach. And all the while the clock ticked on, marking the irreversible moment when their ambitions fractured into despair. I sat at the table, my hands folded neatly, my smile faint but deliberate. I refused to speak. Silence had always been my sharpest blade, and in that moment I let it cut. Marcus stared at me, his eyes pleading for some sign of comfort, some maternal instinct that might soften the blow. He searched my face for the mother who had nursed him through childhood illnesses, who had cheered at his graduations, who had once shielded him from every storm. Instead, he found a stranger, proud and unyielding, the woman his father had trusted to guard the legacy. The weight of my gaze told him more than words ever could. Richard Chen adjusted his glasses and opened the thick folder before him. His voice filled the room with the authority of law. According to the last will and testament of David Harrington Sr., all assets, including the family mansion, the shares, and the investment portfolios, remain under the sole authority of Mrs. Genevieve Harrington. The son, Marcus Harrington, inherits only upon her passing, and only if she so decides. The air grew heavy, the tick of the antique clock slicing the silence into cruel pieces. I heard Marcus gasp. "No, that cannot be true," he stammered, his voice cracking like glass. "Father promised me. He said this house would be mine." His words fell lifeless, no strength behind them. Then Richard continued, his tone steady, merciless in its clarity. "In addition to the mansion, Mrs. Harrington is the legal owner of 3 other properties: a penthouse in Manhattan, a townhouse in Boston, and a villa in the Hamptons. She holds 2 luxury cars and over $50 million in investments. All are in her name, under her sole control." The words struck harder than any weapon. Isabel let out a strangled cry, clutching her handbag as if she could tear the truth apart with her nails. "50 million," she whispered, her voice trembling, her face drained of color. In her eyes I saw a storm of rage and regret. She had thought me frail, ready for a nursing home, unaware that I was the quiet architect of a fortune larger than her shallow dreams. Marcus swayed in his chair, gripping the table to steady himself. I could see the boy he once was, frightened, lost, but now hidden beneath layers of entitlement and greed. His mouth opened, but no words came. His silence betrayed the truth he could not face. Isabel sat frozen, her mind spinning in frantic circles. The words of the will echoed louder than her own thoughts. If only she had waited. If only she had pretended a little longer. If only she had not pushed so hard to drive me out. She saw the fortune slipping through her fingers, and the image of 50 million burned behind her eyes. Her chest tightened with rage, not at herself, but at the cruel irony that she had destroyed her own chance at power. Marcus leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His face was pale, his voice cracked with confusion. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, almost to himself. His words trembled with something caught between a child's need for reassurance and a man's hunger for control. He wanted me to save him, yet the truth was written across his features. He had never truly loved me beyond what I could give. I remained still. My silence weighed heavier than any speech. I let my eyes hold theirs, deep and steady, giving them nothing but reflection. Let them see their greed. Let them feel the emptiness they had carved for themselves. Richard Chen closed the folder with a decisive snap, his voice firm and unyielding. "To conclude, unless Mrs. Harrington grants permission, neither of you will inherit a single asset. These are the explicit terms, and they cannot be disputed." His words hung in the air like a verdict, final and cold. Isabel broke first. Her composure shattered as sobs tore from her throat. She pressed a trembling hand to her face, mascara smearing, her tears not of grief but of rage and bitter regret. She had wanted the mansion, the money, the life of privilege she thought already hers, and now the truth crushed her like iron. Marcus slumped back, his hands covering his face. His shoulders shook, though no words came. For all his quiet defiance, the reality of powerlessness wrapped around him like chains. He had gambled on entitlement, and he had lost. I rose from my chair slowly, the scrape of wood against marble echoing in the silent room. For the first time since I entered, I allowed my voice to carry. "I gave you love. I gave you trust. I even gave you opportunity. But you chose betrayal. From this moment forward, do not expect me to carry the burden of your ambition." My hand rose instinctively to the pearls at my throat, the gift David had given me so long ago. The cool beads steadied me, reminding me of his faith. Without another glance, I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, Marcus and Isabel sat frozen, swallowed by a silence colder than the city skyline. The conference room, once filled with ambition, now felt like a tomb. The glass doors of the law office closed behind me with a soft hiss, and for a moment I let the cool air of Manhattan brush across my face. The city was alive, taxis honking, footsteps pounding the pavement, voices weaving into a restless symphony. I had almost reached the curb when a hand seized mine. The grip was desperate, trembling. I turned and saw Marcus, his face pale, his eyes wide with the kind of fear no grown man wishes to reveal. "Mom, please," he rasped, his voice raw, his throat dry. "We can fix this. We're family. You can't just cut us off." The words clung to me, echoing with a faint trace of the boy he once had been, the boy who used to cling to my skirts when storms rattled the windows at night. His eyes searched mine, torn between terror at losing everything and a fragile hope that some part of his mother might still rescue him. Behind him, Isabel stumbled forward, her mascara smudged, streaks running down her cheeks. Her breath came in shallow bursts, half sobs, half fury. "We made mistakes," she snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "But you can't do this to your own son, to us." There was no remorse in her tone, only a bitter lament for the life of luxury slipping from her reach. I looked at them both, standing there on the bustling street that seemed, for us, suddenly silent. Marcus's fingers clung to me as if I were the last thread holding him above an abyss. Isabel's eyes burned with resentment, her tears more venom than sorrow. For a heartbeat, I saw Marcus as a child again, feverish in his bed, my hands cooling his brow. Then the image dissolved, replaced by the man who had stood silent when his wife humiliated me, who had nodded in agreement when I was told to find my own place. I felt Marcus's hand trembling against mine, but I drew my fingers back slowly until his grip slipped away. Straightening my shoulders, I looked at both of them, their faces pale and drawn beneath the bright morning sun. My voice did not rise. It carried no anger, only a weight sharper than fury. "Family means respect," I said quietly, "and you gave me none, so you will inherit nothing." The words cut through the noise of Manhattan as if the entire city had stilled to listen. Marcus blinked, his mouth opening and closing with no sound, his eyes glistening with disbelief. Isabel's breath caught in her throat, and I saw the fury ignite in her, but she swallowed it, too aware of how powerless she had become. I lifted my hand to my throat, letting my fingers brush the strand of pearls that David had once clasped there. The cool beads pressed into my skin, reminding me that his love and his trust lived here, with me, not with them. Turning the pearls gently, I felt their strength anchor me, as if David himself were whispering his approval. This was no longer about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine to protect. I would never yield. The inheritance, the legacy, and the dignity of my life would not fall into the hands of those who had betrayed me. Marcus's voice broke as he reached for me again, his words spilling out in desperation. "Mom, I'm your son. You raised me. Everything I am is because of you." His plea echoed against the buildings, but to my ears it was less a declaration of love than a confession of dependence. He had leaned on me all his life, never learning to stand alone, and now the truth spilled from his lips without him realizing it. Beside him, Isabel collapsed onto the cold stone steps, her sobs tearing through the busy street. "Do you know what people will say?" she wailed, her face twisted with anguish. "They'll say we lost everything to an old woman." Her cry was sharp, shrill, and filled not with grief for what was gone, but with terror for what others would think. Her pride was bleeding in public view, and for her, humiliation cut deeper than ruin. Passers-by slowed, some staring, some whispering, their curiosity feeding her shame. She buried her face in her hands, trembling with fury, her sobs echoing against the traffic. In that moment I understood. This was not about loss of wealth. For Marcus and Isabel, the greatest wound was the mirror of their own weakness exposed to the world. 2 days later I gathered them in the sitting room, the fire burning low in the hearth, the silence brittle as glass. They waited, their faces pale, their nerves already frayed by sleepless nights. I looked at them evenly, my hands resting calmly on my lap, and spoke without hesitation. "I've already decided. The Hendersons will buy the house. A kind couple, who will love it as it deserves." The words fell like a stone. Marcus staggered back a step, his eyes wide, his voice breaking. "The Hendersons? You'd rather give it to strangers than your own family?" His disbelief cracked into something harsher, a wound he could not mask. I met his gaze, unflinching. "Better strangers who know how to cherish than family who only know how to destroy." My voice was steady, the truth unshaken. I saw the fight drain from him, the last thread of defiance snap under the weight of reality. Isabel trembled beside him, fumbling her phone with shaking hands. "I'll call another lawyer," she hissed, her mascara-streaked face tight with desperation. But Marcus pressed her hand down, his voice hollow, final. "It's over." For a long moment none of us moved. The house that had been their dream was slipping into other hands, and they knew there was nothing left to claw back. I rose from my chair, the pearls at my neck catching the faint light. I did not look back at them. They had chosen betrayal. I had chosen freedom. And now the house, once poisoned by their greed, would finally belong to hearts that could honor it. Richard Chen stepped forward from the doorway, his calm presence a seal of finality. His voice was steady, almost merciful in tone, but the meaning struck like iron. "The sale is already in progress. There's nothing you can contest." The words closed every door Marcus and Isabel had hoped to pry open. Marcus dropped to the stone steps, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, though no sound escaped. The proud son who once imagined himself heir to an empire looked small, broken, a boy stripped of every illusion. Isabel turned sharply away, her teeth sinking into her lip until a bead of blood glistened. She would not cry again in front of me, but her silence screamed louder than her sobs. I did not linger. I turned and walked toward the waiting limousine, each step light, my spine straight. The door opened, and I slipped inside, the leather cool against my palms. Through the tinted glass, I saw them one last time. Marcus hunched on the steps, Isabel beside him, both swallowed by their own despair. They were fragments of ambition scattered on the stones, and I left them there. The limousine pulled away from the grand estate. In the small suitcase at my side lay only 3 things: the pearl necklace David had once clasped around my neck, a handful of old journals filled with memories, and the will that had protected me like armor. These were all I needed, not riches, not approval, only the symbols of love and survival. As the car crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, the horizon opened wide. The first rays of dawn spilled across the water, casting a golden glow that touched my face. I leaned back, letting the light warm me. It felt like a promise, a new beginning. For the first time in years, I was not carrying anyone else's burden. The road ahead was mine alone. The villa in the Hamptons was painted a soft white, its wide porch stretching toward a garden where lavender swayed gently in the breeze. I walked through its rooms the first morning with a quiet awe, the air filled not with grief, but with the salt of the ocean and the promise of freedom. The sea lay only a few steps away, and each sunrise felt like a gift given only to me. I began to shape a life that belonged entirely to myself. In the mornings, I laced my shoes and ran along the shoreline, my breath deep and clean, the waves chasing my steps like playful companions. At noon, I retreated to the sunlit library, where tall windows poured golden light over shelves of books. Sometimes I lost myself in a novel. Other times I let my hands sketch simple shapes, flowers and coastlines, lines that carried no weight of duty. Evenings brought company of a different kind. I attended small gatherings with neighbors who were artists, lawyers, entrepreneurs. They spoke to me not as Marcus's mother, but as Jeannie, a woman with her own story. We laughed, we sipped wine, and I felt myself unfold into a new circle of belonging. One afternoon, I sat at a piano for the first time in decades. The opening notes of David's favorite piece rose under my fingers. Once those notes would have broken me, but now I smiled, letting the melody fill the room. It was not sorrow that lingered, but gratitude. For the first time in years, I was not defined by loss, but by the freedom to live and to begin again. The apartment in Queens was nothing like the mansion they had once called their own. The ceilings were low, the paint already peeling in places, and the walls so thin that every argument bled into the hallways for the neighbors to hear. Outside their window came the constant noise of traffic, the shouts of children playing, and the hum of televisions in the apartments above and below. It was a life stripped bare, a sharp contrast to the marble halls and chandeliers they had once taken for granted. At night, Isabel sat hunched over the kitchen table, the yellow light flickering above her head, a crumpled financial newspaper trembling in her hands. Her eyes scanned the headlines about rising property values, and she began to sob, her voice cracking into the silence. "We destroyed it ourselves, Marcus. $50 million, Marcus, 50 million. Her words turned into hiccuping sobs, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Marcus sat across from her, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the piles of debt notices spread across the table. His career had collapsed under the weight of public shame. No one wanted to work with the man branded as the ungrateful son cut off by his own mother. He pressed his temples with both hands, as if he could hold his crumbling world together by sheer force. Their nights were filled with fights that never ended. Isabel slammed the paper down, her voice shrill. "You let her outsmart you. You were blind, Marcus. Stupid enough to believe she would just hand it over." Marcus shouted back, his voice hoarse. "And you, Isabel, it was your endless ambition, your greed for more that drove us into this pit." They screamed under the weak glow of the lamp, their cheap furniture rattling with every slam of a fist. In those moments, they no longer looked like the glamorous couple they once presented to the world. Isabel collapsed into tears, her makeup smeared into black streaks, her sobs echoing against the cramped walls. Marcus pulled at his hair, his breath ragged, his body trembling with helpless rage. The air inside the apartment felt heavy, suffocating, as if even the room itself was closing in on them. They lived inside a spiral now, trapped in cycles of regret, anger, and debt. Every day pulled them further from the lives they thought they deserved, and every night, in that small apartment, the ghosts of what they had lost clawed at them until dawn. The tide crept low against the shore as I walked along the sands of the Hamptons, my footprints stretching behind me like a quiet story written in the earth. The air was cool and fragrant with salt, the horizon awash in crimson and gold. With each step I felt lighter, as if the years of burden were dissolving into the waves. I paused, turned toward the sea, and lifted my glass of wine. The sun caught the rim, scattering fire across the surface, and I smiled. It was not a smile of defiance nor of revenge, but of liberation. Far away, in a cramped apartment in Queens, Isabel slammed a cheap glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. Her voice rose in bitter wails, echoing against peeling paint and thin walls that offered no privacy. She screamed at fate, at Marcus, at herself, but no answer came. Her life had shrunk to clutter and shadows, a prison of her own making. The contrast was stark. Isabel collapsed in fury and despair, suffocated by the walls closing in around her. I, by the ocean's edge, lifted my glass higher, the warmth of the fading sun bathing me in light. The past no longer chained me. I had walked through grief, betrayal, and silence, and now I stood reborn beneath the sky's blazing farewell. If this story stirred something in you, pause to honor the strength that so often lies hidden beneath silence and sorrow. Pass these words to someone who might need to remember that respect, resilience, and rebirth can rise even from the harshest trials. And if there is a dream you have set aside, let this be the sign to bring it back into the light.